Afternoon panel, one of our last panels here about using mastery grading in upper level classes. My name is Robert Talbert. I'm from Grand Valley State, and we have three great panelists with us today: Brett Benish, Jessica O'Shaughnessy, and Chad Wiley. And so I'm going to let them introduce themselves one by one as they go through their slides. Go ahead and advance to the next slide, please, because there's just a little bit of verbiage about the usual stuff about recording the webinar. We are recording the webinar, including this panel. We're going to post the slides so you can review them later. We do retain the right to rebroadcast and redistribute the recording. And by participating, you're agreeing that your contributions will become part of that recording. That includes the chat. A number of people have asked about the chat, and yeah, that chat's going to be available for us all. So I'll be monitoring the Q&A as you go. The chat we're leaving for that belongs to you all, the attendees, so you just monitor yourselves and take care of the chat yourself. I'll be in the Q&A. And now I'm going to hand it over to our panelists. I believe, Brett, you are up first. So let's go ahead and move to the next slide and let Brett take over.
Yeah. Well,
actually, why don't you three introduce yourselves? Yep. Go back a slide. Sorry about that. Why don't you three introduce yourselves, and then we'll turn it to Brett.
I'm Brett. I'm at the College of St. Benedict and St. John's University, a large liberal arts school in central Minnesota, and I'm the baldest one of the three of us.
I'm Jessica O'Shaughnessy. I'm at Shenandoah University, which is about 2,000 undergraduates, 2,000 graduate students, liberal arts college.
I'm Chad Wiley from Emporia State University in Emporia, Kansas. I think I'm like the middle of the bald scale in this panel. So.
Not only because I'm not bald at all.
Okay, Brett, I'll let you take it from here.
All right. So a little bit about me. I started mastery grading in 2010 after an American high school teacher who was living in Sweden convinced me to do it over Twitter. And I've taught a variety of upper division courses. Here are a list of several of them. And kind of the two things that maybe I haven't heard so much is I think if you do it right, mastery grading is not so much about grading or assessment, it's more about instruction. So to give you a quick idea, the old way of teaching proofs would be I'd show students a bunch of great proofs, and then I'd ask them to mimic them, and then they'd either do it or they wouldn't. I'd give them 7 out of 10 or whatever. But if you do this right, and you get the specifications and the standards to be very specific, which is hard, it's hard work, that's actually instruction. And it helps, by forcing myself to identify what makes this a good proof, it helps students out immensely. So I hope that, that's the way I think about mastery-based learning, mastery-based testing, is that's really an instructional tool. And this has equity issues. In particular, my understanding is that first-gen students oftentimes don't come into classes with the same level of knowledge. And by giving them very specific instructions on what leads to success, you're leveling the playing field. The other thing that mastery grading has done for me is made grading suck less. So I'm going to talk a little bit about these on the next slide. So these are courses, upper division, and these are courses where I'm really trying to get the liberal arts ideas of thinking and writing. So because of that, the next slide is going to say that I use specifications grading for this. And my specifications, which are the next 2 bullet points, I stole from other people. I need mathematical specifications, and there's a great rubric from Brown and Michelle that say the proof has to be readable, has to be valid, mathematically correct, it has to be fluent. I was missing the fluent piece, and that's basically you're using appropriate notation. If you've ever read really old mathematics, there might be paragraphs and paragraphs of English prose without a variable to be seen. That's tough to read, and so that's part of the training for getting students how to write. And I stole writing specs and adjusted them from Anders Hendrickson. So by getting the details down, like the students really learn a lot. And so one success that I've had that's made my life a lot better, say, is weekly writing homework. And that is, I'll give the students some sort of problem, it's a math problem, but I'm only going to assess them on the writing specifications. So there's a detailed list of things like use the royal we, don't start a sentence with a variable, use correct punctuation, and that's all I assess them on. And I swear, but by week 4, every single student will be handing in very pretty proofs that make my life much, much easier, and I can focus more on giving them content on the math. The other win for writing, for just assessing on writing, is that students will come and ask for help on the math even though I'm not grading on them. And then I can give them exactly as much help as they need. For some, it might be just a small hint. For some, I might actually just go out and tell them exactly how to do it, because that's not part of the assignment. I'm just grading on the writing. The next thing is that I have kind of a light standards-based grading component, and that's basically just topics. So it's not a good standard, it's just kind of topics. The next slide, I'll give you an example for linear algebra. Like, I'll ask them to do a variety of problems. They have to do some problems on bases, some on vector spaces, some on linear transformations, because I want them to have a wide breadth. But I'm grading them on the math and writing specifications in these classes. So my final grade just ends up being kind of how many did you get from each topic and how difficult were they? Linda Nelson has this idea of you can get a better grade by running more hurdles or higher hurdles. And so that's the broad framework of what I do in the classes. And with that, I'm gonna hand it off to Jessica.
Hi, I'm Jessica. Again, I'm now the Assistant Dean for Student Success at Shenandoah, which is in Virginia. I teach computer science and math, but my upper division courses are primarily the algebras, so linear algebra and abstract algebra. If you go to the next slide, you can actually pull up several of the bullet points for linear algebra. So I really primarily do mastery-based testing in linear algebra. I focus those on content objectives. So for linear algebra, I teach it, it's a 300 level course, and I teach it with both computational and proof-based. So pretty much every topic has some more computational problem and more proof-based problem. So kind of they have to be able to show me that they understand both the computational piece and the proof piece to be able to master that concept. Sometimes it drives them crazy because they don't feel as strong on the proof side of the class, but so it really forces them to have to understand the proof work in that course, which I really like. I do also incorporate some objectives that are based on applications. So I like linear algebra for them to see like how it's used and where it comes up. So I do a lot of incorporating application as well. Mostly how my course works, I sort of split it into kind of a quarter of semester. And so they'll get like concepts, and then there'll be sort of one concept that includes some kind of application. They have to apply what they've learned in a situation. I do programming projects. Those I do outside of the testing. And some of that is just, you know, I use Python now. I've used Octave and MATLAB in the past. But for now I'm using Python, and it's just to get them sort of a feel for how to use Python and how to sort of do some of the things we do in class in Python and get some visualization with it. Go on the next bullet point. So I also do abstract. I did a couple of different things with abstract. So I converted abstract specifically because my students asked for it. So the group of students who had registered for the class came to me and they were like, will you please convert this class to mastery? And I was a little nervous to do it because, for one, I was nervous about finding the right variety of questions to make it robust enough that I was going to be happy with it. But I also didn't know how they would do with it. It turns out to be the best decision I ever made. It was hands down the best class I've ever taught. So these broke up into a few different things. Some of them were more techniques based. So for our abstract algebra course, you don't actually have, there's no real prerequisite for it. I think it's calculus or pre-calculus. I'm not, there's reasons why that happened in the curriculum, but so we sometimes get students who haven't had any intro to proofs. And so this is their first experience with proofs sometimes. So I incorporated some things that I knew they were weaker on from their previous courses, such as some different proof techniques. So some of them were techniques and some of them were content focused. So I did a little bit with, you know, prove this as a group. And it was really nice to sort of build on one to the next. So first they had to prove something was a group. That was one concept. And then in the next one, they had to be able to use the group axioms to prove that some property of a group. And then in the next one, they could use other theorems or something a little more complicated. Now, I always found with testing in proof-based courses, one of my concerns is that they don't always have enough time to come up with a solid proof, right? I think proof work takes a lot of time, and if you're doing it right, it requires a lot of thinking. So I incorporated a proof portfolio that allowed for revision opportunities. And they loved it. I did not love it. I gave them way too many proofs that were required. So I had 16 different concepts. They had to put in a longer proof for each of those concepts. I ended up with proof portfolios that were 50 to 75 pages long, which was not what I was hoping for, but they were really well done. So that gave them an opportunity to do longer proofs. My restrictions on the longer proofs were it couldn't be something we did in class. It couldn't be something that they just looked up. They had to come up with the proof on their own, but it could be something that they had attempted somewhere else, like in homework or something like that, because I was grading homework based on completion rather than partial credit. Now I'm going to pass it over to Chad.
All right. So yeah, I'm Chad. I teach at Emporia State University. I started using mastery grading in I think around 2016 after meeting Robert at a conference and complaining that I didn't like the way I was grading, and he said, "Hey, you should check this out," and I did, and it was all downhill from there, all uphill from there, I guess. So I've used this in a very wide variety of classes, partly because of the way that our master's program is structured at Emporia State, and I'll talk about that in just a minute. But just in terms of the upper division classes, I've taught a pretty good variety. You can see some of them here. I'm teaching knot theory right now as a summer course, but some of these are graduate courses at ESU. Some of them are undergraduate, like upper division undergraduate courses. So I'll talk a little bit about what the environment is like at Emporia State, like how our classes are structured, and then how my classes in particular are structured. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide. This is all out of order because I don't prepare very well. So I talked a little this morning about kind of my general thought process for putting my classes together. I want to have a big emphasis on good writing, in addition to having, logically correct arguments. And I think the revision process is really central to that. Basically like Brett was saying. But I think it also helps in our particular situation. So most of my upper level classes are online. We have an online graduate program at Emporia State, so an online master's. And so every semester, with a few exceptions, like most semesters, I'm teaching 1 or 2 online graduate courses. And those are usually, depending on the class, usually start at about 20 students. And so for one thing, this means that we have a lot of students in this program, and so we have to offer a lot of courses, and that means I get a chance to teach a lot of different things. So that's why I've got a bunch of different classes that I've translated into this format. One of the classes that I want to talk a little bit about is our graduate intro to proofs class, which sounds like a strange thing, but it's because of the particular population of students that we serve. A lot of our students are current high school teachers, or they're working at a community college, or they want to be working at a community college, and they might have a math background, they might have like a sort of math adjacent background. We get some students with like engineering backgrounds. And they want to come in and they want to work on a math master's degree, but they either haven't written a proof in like 10 or 15 years, which does not bode well for jumping into like a group theory class, or they may never have written proofs, depending on if they had more of an education background. And so we need to have a class that's there to kind of get them up to speed to see if they can actually get through the rest of the program. And so I think mastery grading is an especially good fit for that, because this process of having them go through and revise their work and polish it and make it better is even more important for this population of students that really needs to show that they can get through the next 2 years. to finish up a master's. Okay, so what are some of the things that I do in those courses? In that particular course, in that Intro to Proof course, I have a particular assignment that I especially like, that I think helps out. It's this Proofwriters Workshop. Part of the issue is I always have trouble like getting a simple yet comprehensive rubric for what counts as a good proof. Like to some extent, it's a judgment call on my part, but I don't want them to I don't want to tell them, oh, I'll pass it when I think it's good enough, without giving them any more feedback than that. So the idea that I hit upon was to like once a week kind of turn the tables on them. I will post some proofs that I've written and have them be the graders, and have them discuss like what grade that they would give this, knowing what I'm looking for. You know, can they find any mistakes? Sometimes there are mistakes, sometimes there aren't. Sometimes I deliberately write them in a confusing way. And this gets them used to what I'm looking for. It also gives me a chance to preview common errors that are going to come in on homework. So it kind of pulls double duty there. So that's been a pretty valuable component of the class. Because my classes are often online, I will generally try and build in a kind of class community component. This is usually like an online discussion where I try and get them to talk about the course in a non-homework format, and also try to get them to talk to one another. So I might have them discuss like, you know, like compare and contrast two different methods of working with knots, for example, that I'm in my current class. Or can they go out and find something related to the stuff that we covered this week but wasn't actually in the textbook? Can they, you know, go out and learn a little stuff on their own and show it to the rest of the class? So this connects them to one another, and it gets them thinking about things in a slightly higher level way. I also, partly to encourage, again, more a better feeling of like talking to one another, I'll usually have them do some kind of like presentation, and that pulls double duty again, not only just sort of bringing the class together so they can watch each other's presentations, but also to get them better at communicating, which is part of my focus for these sorts of classes. So that's kind of the overview of what I do. I guess I will pass it off to everyone else now.
Make sure I'm unmuted. Yes, so thank you for your, thanks to all three of our panelists for your presentations here. I'm going to the Q&A now, and a couple of questions here. Brett, you have a question here in the Q&A. Could you describe the differences between the specs writing assignments that don't focus on the correct math, and then these other assignments that do focus on correct mathematics?
Yeah, the only real difference between them is what I'm grading. So it might be the same question, right? I have two questions. One of them could go to writing, one of them could go to essentially a portfolio, as Jessica described, where one of them I might grade on math and one I might not. I mainly want to separate it out so students can focus on writing at some point without having to worry about, did I set up the induction correctly? So that's really the only difference. And then, like I said, part of the advantage is then I get to help them out as much as they need. So I want to make the questions as similar as possible so I can help them out as much as possible.
Okay. Violetta is asking, are midterms, final exams part of the grading scales for these upper level classes? Maybe we could expand that into a discussion too about time testing in general. Plays a little bit different role in upper level classes. So could you all talk about whether you're giving midterms and final exams, and if so, how does that play into your mastery grading systems?
I do give exams, but they're not. So my final exam is sort of just an opportunity to re-show mastery. So it's just another testing opportunity. It's not a separate timed graded test. To get around some of the timed portions, because I think that's one of my biggest concerns with my upper division courses, is that timed component of a test. I've done some things where I allowed students an opportunity to retake through an oral retake. In particular, I had a student who had very severe test anxiety, but she could come in and write down solutions to problems on my whiteboard, and she could explain everything perfectly. It's just as soon as she sat down with a test, she sort of froze up. So I gave her I gave it to the whole class so that it was fair, but in particular, it was with her in mind that I allowed people to do some oral retakes. But so those are some of the ways that I've gotten around. So they can choose to just do a single concept in a particular test. They don't have to do all of them. And that's how I'm getting around, you know, the timed issue.
So I've taken kind of the extreme approach to this, in that for my proof focused classes, I've basically just stopped giving exams altogether. And that's a position that I've come to kind of recently, and I think I'm the only person in the department who does it. So I still feel slightly insecure about it. But you know, I was dealing with students who were having test anxiety, and you know, proctoring for online classes is a big hassle. And you know, worrying about integrity and you know, cheating and all that stuff. But also, like, this is something that came up during the table talks earlier. I think that when you're putting together a mastery grading system, or I mean, hopefully if you're putting together any kind of system, you really ought to think about what it's communicating to students. Like, whatever you personally might think is important in the class, what you grade is what you're telling students is important, right? So if you say, I want you to know the concepts behind this, but you're only testing them on doing like rote calculations, then they're rightly going to conclude that the important part of the class is rote calculation. And so that got me thinking about, you know, when I'm teaching students to do proofs, like, what I'm testing them on is how well they can do proofs quickly, right? And under a bunch of time pressure and under extra stress. And that's not what I want them to be good at, right? I want them to do what professional mathematicians do, which is like work on a problem for a long time and come back to it and make mistakes and go back and fix them and stuff like that. So I felt like tests were actively working against what I wanted to see in my classes. So I just dumped them completely. I still feel a little insecure about not having some sort of capstone, and that's partly why I started putting more of an emphasis on like these presentations or portfolios.
I'm pretty similar in that I've dumped midterms and finals for the most part. I'll reserve some quizzes, but the quizzes are typically proof formats that they should know. So like, okay, you're gonna have to show that this is a subspace. So going in, you should basically know how you're gonna do it going in, because I don't want to test speed at doing mathematics. For any sort of difficult thing that they don't know what's coming, I use out of class assessment.
I'll throw something in on this too. I'm sorry, Brett, I didn't know if you were done or not.
Oh, I'm done. I'd rather
okay.
listen to you.
You know, we talked about that before. So in some of my proof-based courses, like I teach quite often this discrete structures for computer science course. It's a math prefixed course, but 95% of the students in it typically are computer science majors. And there's proofs in here. It's sort of a baby intro to proofs course among many other things. But I decided that students in that course should be able more to analyze the structure of a proof and read a proof than necessarily write a great proof. They should be able to write a proof, but that's not what they're going to be doing. So for time testing, I found one thing that has been very helpful is to one of the standards is to be able to, if you're given a conditional statement, set up a proof by contradiction. Be able to show me you can set up a proof that's using a direct proof. Show me how you can do this using the contrapositive. If you're going to prove something with strong induction, state the base case, state what the inductive hypothesis is, and state what you would do next. And these are really good things to assess in quizzes, like in-class quizzes or on final exams. But I think I am more along the lines of the other panelists here, that if you're using specs grading or standards-based grading, mastery-based grading, whatever we want to call it, you know, the need for a final exam is much less. This is a discussion we had in our department after we pivoted online, and I've been department chair this year. A lot of our faculty were asking, well, do we need to give a final exam? How do we get final exams? And my question back to them was like, do you want to give a final exam? I mean, why would you want to give a final exam? I mean, what's the purpose of giving a final exam? We don't have, we're not an institution that requires final exams. So look, I mean, let's justify whether or not we really need to give final exams. And this really threw a lot of people off because it's like, what? We got to give a final exam. It's like, it's down here in the fine print of my contract, right? Like, no, there's nothing here that says we have to give a traditional final exam. We have to give some sort of cumulative experience, like Chad was mentioning, but nothing like a final exam. And in a mastery grading situation, I feel like you don't have to give a final exam as much because students are assessing and reassessing constantly all semester long. And so it's just a continuous process of improvement and retrieval practice and constant review that is the main purpose for giving a final exam, in my view. So, you know, a final exam might just be a final reassessment on any 5 standards you wish or something like that. And you can make it whatever you want, but I think that the need for the traditional cumulative midterm and final exam is very much less for an upper level course and also for a lower level course if you're using a master grading situation. There's another question in the queue here from Monica that's almost on the opposite end of the assessment spectrum. She's asking, she's curious how mastery grading might or might not work for a semester-long project, which a number of upper-level courses in pure and applied mathematics, especially applied mathematics, are employing. And I wonder if our panelists have any thoughts about that.
I think specifications grading in particular is great for a project because you can define and let them know exactly what the project should be, right? Should it be a recording? If so, you know, how long should the recording be? What format? How many pages type should it be? What mathematical ideas do you want to include it in there? How should you do it? All that stuff helps the students be successful. It's not necessarily even about grading, it's about instructing them. Here's how you do a successful project, and then you can assess them on whether they're successful or not. So especially projects, I think it's more important to give the kind of scaffolding with specifications and standards.
I agree. I would say when I do projects, I sort of, in a sense, I give them deadlines throughout the semester. So like a first part of the project might be due within the first month, let's say, but I would often say, okay, this is like a first draft of whatever you're working on. And so try to revise it and give them feedback so that, you know, they're getting that revision process throughout the semester. It depends on how the project is done. So for some projects, they don't necessarily build on each other. They can kind of like separate it in chunks. But for other ones that build on it, at some point they have to move on from that. So for example, in statistics, we do some survey techniques and things, and then they have to build up a project, and it culminates in a sort of conference type experience. So for that, they do kind of have to have sort of a deadline, although we can push it back and they can revise pretty close to then when they have to do a little more work with it.
Yeah, my student statistics projects got a lot better after I implemented the specifications and standards-based grading. They didn't know what to do until then. They'd never done a statistics project before, but I needed to teach them. I needed to tell them what it looks like. Chad?
I haven't done anything that like spans an entire course, but for the presentations that I do, I make sure that that they have some, like I arrange the class so that there's some time at the end of the semester for them to really focus on it, where they're not also doing a bunch of other stuff. And that helps because I can also use that time to give them some like catch-up revisions on homework and stuff like that. So, so that's helpful. But also, like everything else, I want to make sure that they have chances to revise it. So if they're feeling at first like I don't really know how I should be doing this, like it's not so stressful that like if I do this badly the first time, my grade is tanked. Like I give them feedback on that just like everything else, and then they can go back and re-record it, or depending on how they put it together, they might only have to edit a little bit of it. And we kind of work toward getting something that everyone's happy with. I'd probably, if I was going to do a semester long thing, I would probably just kind of stretch that process out, like have some specific deadlines throughout the semester, say like, here's where I want your first draft, and then we'll talk about it, and now you can work on the second one.
And so just to follow up on that for all three of you, you have specifications set up for your projects. What do they look like, and where do you post them? Do you give them out at the beginning? Do you give them out in sequence as they progress through the project, or what's the logistics of that?
I give them out in sequence as they progress through a project. So I'm specifically thinking of the statistics one. That's the one that I would have done a full like semester long project. And because each component was really a different part of the course, like it built on each other, but it was a different part of the course. So I gave them, along with the project description, an expectation of what those objectives were.
I do the opposite. In planning my course, I come up with all the assignments and specifications all in one document so they can just look in one place. I don't know if that's good. It might be overwhelming, but they have everything at the beginning. And so in statistics, it might be something like, right, here's a due date. Here's what you need to address. You need to address the hypotheses. You need to check whether the tests are valid. You need to do a power using this applet, a power calculation. And so it just goes through and tells them to look at all of those. For capstone class, I might do something like, you need to annotate it, like Jessica said, they're milestones. You need to have an annotated bibliography by this point. You have to have an outline, and it has to include whatever, 3 different sources. And so I just try to tell them exactly what I want, and then I'm happy when I get it.
What happens if a student or a student group fails to meet a milestone or a deadline?
I'm very lenient on it. I'm like, I mean, what's the point in saying, I do try and keep them, and I do sometimes take off, like I'll put, you'll lose a certain % or something just as a motivation. But for the most part, I'm pretty lenient on when things get turned in, because I try to think about what's my purpose of this. Is my purpose to get them to stick to deadlines? If it is, then you can be stricter with it, but that's not my purpose. My purpose is there's a final deadline for this project that I want completed to a certain standard. So I tend to be pretty lenient. They actually tend to stick with it. I usually give like some small points for the particular deadline, but it won't kill them if they miss it either.
I use tokens, so students can spend a token to reattempt. And I need 3 levels of grading I found, and one is basically you get credit for it, and then there are 2 levels of need to revise. And the first level is you need to revise because the student made a mistake that they should have known about, like missing a deadline, which most of my deadlines are fake, or like they didn't spell check and just have a mess. Then I charge them a token. But if they're missing something due to something that they're learning this semester about mathematics or statistics, then I don't charge them a token at all. That's just part of the learning process. And then on top of that, I give them way too many tokens, more tokens than they need at the beginning of the semester.
Well, it puts you on Team Softie or too many tokens or whatever the hashtag is these days. I like what you said. I like the idea from all of y'all about, you focus on, you put the main focus of the grading on the stuff that matters the most. Like you have to be very clear about what your objectives are. What's your goal in even giving the assignment? You want students to meet deadlines, but if that's not the primary purpose of the assignment or a primary purpose of the assignment, you don't want to make this like missing a deadline will just kill the whole assignment. It's something that you could solve with tokens, or I could see you setting up an assignment to say you'll get an excellent on this assignment if you do all the math right and only miss a couple of deadlines. You'll get a sufficient or good enough grade on this if you do all the math right and miss half the deadlines or something. And it's easy to fix. It doesn't kill you if you don't do it, but you really ought to be doing it. Related to this, Austin Moore. I'm sorry, go ahead, Brett.
One other important thing for master grading, I think, is it gives students hope longer. The worst thing for me is if I give students 2 midterms before Thanksgiving and they fail them both, like there's no hope of them passing the class in their points-based system, so why would they keep learning? Under mastery-based learning, they typically keep on learning through the end and keep on bugging me to teach them more. So that's a win.
Yeah, totally. Austin Moore was asking also about something related to this. He says, I like to develop specifications for my senior capstone writing and speaking. There's a survey paper and a conference presentation components to the capstone. What are some good resources for Austin and anybody else who might be interested in those questions where they could begin to start to develop those specifications?
I'm in my second year of capstone and I have some of those things. Last year I had kind of specifications that would get you to a B and guarantee you to a B. And then if you want to grade higher than the B, you had to kind of, it was a very touchy-feely subjective thing. And so I had conferences with the students to let them know if they're above an A or if they're above a B. This summer I'm working on getting them nailed down. So I will upload the specifications that I have to Rachel's repository, and then I'll email Austin once I have them. That's a project for next week.
Yeah, that is definitely an area that I feel like I ought to be better at, that I need to work on getting better at, because to some extent I feel like there is always this sort of subjective component to evaluating this kind of thing. Probably not on something as in-depth as like a conference presentation or like a term paper or something. But one of the things that I found helpful, I do list specifications, but I think probably students find it more helpful when I do these presentations. I give them a sample that I've put together, so they can, I think that gives them like a baseline to go on, and then they can kind of compare that to the specifications and see what they want to be doing.
Yeah, I would also echo Chad's comment there that giving exemplars of work that you're going to be grading and what kind of work maps to which specification is hugely important in upper level courses, where many students, despite the fact they're in an upper level course, are still kind of trying to make their way and find their place in the material. I wanted to also add a resource. I'm going to drop it here in the chat window, and it's just a book that we all ought to read. It's by Linda Nilsson, called Specifications Grading. She literally wrote the original book on this. Specifications Grading, Mastery-Based Grading goes back before Linda's book, but it's a great little 200-page book. And she doesn't write much about math in this book, but there's a lot of talk about specifications for projects. And so for anybody who's interested, projects in humanities courses and social work and other kinds of areas where semester-long projects are done, real similar to kind of stuff we're talking about here. TJ makes up a good point. She's not a mathematician. Linda and I are friends, and she's a mention. I used to work for Linda at Vanderbilt, and she's absolutely wonderful. We had hoped to have her here at this conference, but maybe next year. But yeah, she does have like this little anti-math thing at one point, and I've given her crap about that before. But her book is fantastic, and everybody ought to read it. There's one question here for me that I wanted to take here in the Q&A. Have I found that mastery-based grading has been useful in discrete math, my discrete math for CS course, in improving student attitudes toward the content? Especially, he says, Michael Levitt here says, in my experience, CS students often exhibit a lot of resistance and hostility towards math/theory courses, more so than maybe in business calculus and so forth. I think it doesn't hurt. I mean, building a positive attitude towards mathematics for anybody, even math majors for that matter, I mean, it's not going to be located specifically in the assessment piece of your course. I mean, it has to come from your own love for the discipline, your enthusiasm in the course, how well you connect the material to your students, how good of a learning environment you set up where students can make connections between different concepts and that sort of thing. But you can certainly really kill that by bad assessment, right? And we've all seen it. Most of us have done it. A lot of us before we switched to mastery-based grading. When a student gets, like Chad was mentioning, or maybe it was Brett, I don't know, I think it was Brett, if you get a 42 out of 100 on the first exam and you're fighting just to get to the start line for the entire semester, now you're going to hate math because you have that's your experience, that's your touchstone experience. And I think on the other hand, if you set up a mastery system where failures are not final. Nothing is really final until the final, until finals week. I mean, the word eventually is very, very important in mastery grading. And it's that hope-giving signal. It says, like, look, I'm giving you a safe space to make all kinds of mistakes here. And, you screw up one day, it doesn't define you. Okay, you just come back, get up back on the horse and do it again. I found that CS students particularly really resonate with this system. I have to do almost no salesmanship with mastery grading because computer science students are very, very used to this idea of nothing works the first time, right? I mean, you write a program to do something, it's never going to work the first time unless it's something like Hello World. Instead, you know you're going to have mistakes. There's going to be all kinds of crap going on in your code, and you just know it's going to happen, but you just do your best, and you watch the compiler, and you try to figure out what the feedback is, and you try to make it right the second time. And so that's how I have pitched it to my CS students. Like, look, you all write code here, okay, so you know how this works, and this is how our grading system's going to work. And they're like, huh, all right. That's finally a mathematician that gets it. It's kind of their viewpoint on this. So I found that approach has been so much in alignment with the native way that computer scientists assess their own work that it's helped them kind of see that math is very useful, and it's not completely opposed to computer science. In fact, there's a lot of good it can do, and it just kind of helps keep spirits high throughout the semester, I feel like.
I want to
There's another.
Maybe
Go ahead,
something.
please.
Just you had mentioned, that if they had a bad day, they're not a failure. And I think that's been really important in my classes, and in particular in building up the women that I have in the math program and the computer science program, that has really made a difference for them. I've noticed that we actually have a lot more women now that we've been doing mastery grading than we did before, because they don't feel like a failure if they got something wrong. They feel like they are being built up, right? I write lots of positive comments, and here's what you're doing well, and here's where you can do better. And I think that really, at least in my experience, has resonated with my female majors in both math and CS.
Yeah, that's a great point. It's a great point. Cassie, Matt has a kind of a follow-up question here, but Cassie's been in the queue longer, so I'm going to go to her question first. Does anyone have any experience using mastery grading or specs or whatever we're calling this? We really got to come up with a brand here before this is all over with, folks. In IBL classes that are focused on presentations and group work, and is there anything I should be thinking about in terms of setting up my standards or specs or tips about how to integrate presentations into grading? I wonder if any of our panelists could speak to that.
I do presentations in my classes, mostly in my calc classes. I've done it in abstract and linear though as well. And some of the things I tend to focus on the presentations are sort of mastering concepts like actually being able to talk to your audience, turning out and being able to have a conversation with your audience, being able to answer questions even if you don't fully know the answer, and just sort of engaging your audience. So I tend to focus some of my concepts on that piece of it, that audience engagement, because I find that they are really not very good at that in the beginning. They have a lot of trouble they're so nervous because they feel like everybody's judging them when they stand up sometimes, that they have a hard time engaging with their audience. So that's one of the things I focus on in the grading of those presentations in my mastery classes.
Now, I use IBL as well. I typically separate the in-class from the assessment just because I want to remove any sort of fear about making a mistake in front of the class as being a missed opportunity or going against them, but I don't know that that's necessarily the right way to go. So I haven't graded the in-class work just because I want that to be completely free of assessment. So I don't have a good answer.
Yeah, I also unfortunately don't have a great answer here, just because a lot of the classes that I'm teaching are online. That IBL is harder to implement there. Like our classes end up being like partly synchronous, but like, a lot of our students are working full time and they can't be there at the times that we have meetings. So IBL is really tough to pull off. I do have one class at the undergrad level that I use IBL in. The problem is like the IBL setup works really well, and I'm usually reworking at least one other class every semester that I teach it. And so I haven't got around to like masterizing it, or whatever you want to call it, that class yet. It's the one class that I feel like I really got to redo this. I really do. But I'm like, oh, but it's working so well. It's just going to cause so much extra work. So eventually I'll have a good answer for this, but right now I don't.
I'll add, Cassie, that I do also do like POGIL activities in my classes and IBL worksheets and group work. I actually tend to pull those separate from the mastery grading objectives and sort of assign a small percentage just for completion on those, only because I want them to be exploring and not really thinking of this as something they need to be getting right necessarily.
I'll add, you should ask TJ Hitchman.
Sorry, we do have some we do have some masters, have some IBL masters here in the crowd here. So I know TJ, you just said no, but I'm pitching it out to you anyway. If you want to answer that in the chat or offline, TJ Hitchman here is an expert at IBL, and I'm sure he'd be able to answer that question really, really well, even though he denies it. While we're doing that, Matt, getting back to Matt's question, this is an interesting one, I think. Is there a worry about giving too much or false hope to students, right? We were just talking about one of the great features of mastery grading is that it gives students hope longer, I think is what Brett mentioned. Are there students who maybe, quote unquote, should have withdrawn from your course but hung on because they thought the mastery grading system could help save them? I would say this is definitely not an upper division course only question, but I'd love to hear answers from the panelists on this one.
Yes. I would say they do have sometimes false hope, but I also think for the most part, that's a little more on the rare side. They know where they're at. They know what they understand, what they don't. I actually did a statistical analysis of my calculus courses for the last 7 years and looked at the DFW rates and the withdrawal rates. The withdrawal rates were slightly lower, but not much. So I don't think it actually made that much difference. I think they were pretty well aware of where they were at.
Yeah, anecdotally, I would say, yeah, it's a concern, but it's actually better, I think, than when I was in the point space, because I have a better sense of where students are. Students have a tougher time convincing themselves that they're doing okay, because if you get 6 out of 10 on a bunch of problems, you can usually tell yourself, oh, well, if I was only up by a minus sign, when of course that means you're going north instead of south. Right, and whereas mastery-based grading, like, it's a clearer picture and I can have a better conversation. And I'm actually, since I, am kind of assessing them more frequently, I can keep up with them. And that means I have to force myself to have the hard conversations and say, I think you need to be, here by next week. So let's talk then. But yeah, sometimes I will have to advise students to drop, but I feel like I'm better informed when I do. And I feel like the students are better informed when we have that conversation too.
Yeah, I agree with Jessica and Brett's comments. I've had a few uncomfortable situations where a student probably should have dropped, but really thought they could do it, and it didn't turn out well. But they're pretty rare. Most times, I think students under the system do have a better sense of where they're at, and they kind of take care of themselves. Like, they know when they should stick it out and when they shouldn't.
Mm-hmm.
One thing I would add on to this is that we do want to be clear with the students about where they stand, though. I mean, we want students to be well informed about this. I've had some students in the past who hung on and probably should have dropped, and it turned out it was on me because I wasn't communicating the grading system clearly enough. Like, they thought that they could reassess like everything in the last week of class when really they couldn't. It was just not clear enough in the syllabus. So part of that is on the student, part of that is on us to write clear documentation. I think that's an important part of setting up a mastery grading course. Is our writing has to be like crystal clear and the messaging has to be on point all the time in order for the students to get the information that they need.
I might add one more thing in there actually along those lines. Something I do with all of my classes that I started pretty early on when I did mastery grading was they all start with zeros in the class. So, and as they master concepts, I build up their percentage. So they're failing the course pretty much the entire semester. I don't give them ticking away from something. And so they tend to worry that they're going to fail when they're not. So I tend to have a lot of conversations with students where they come in and they're like, I think I'm failing. And I'm like, no, you're on track for like a B or something. So I think keeping their grades low at the beginning also helps avoid this problem of, I think I'm doing okay, but I'm not.
Right. We have about 10 minutes left, and I'm kind of trying to be mindful that the next session starts immediately at 4:30 with no break. So maybe you can continue to ask your questions, but I want to make sure I get to clear Merriman's question here, because I think it's really important sort of equity question here. Does anyone have any insight into evaluating students who are not necessarily comfortable with English? One possibly overthinking fear is that emphasis on fluency in rubrics can lead them thinking they can't succeed since they are thinking English fluency instead of math fluency. Obviously, a clear rubric is helpful here. And so I wonder if y'all could talk about that a little bit. This is something that, oddly enough, this has come up in, not in my teaching, but in my administrative work this year when we're doing merit reviews for our faculty. Not all of our faculty are native English speakers, and we've had this feeling that we disproportionately reward faculty who write better portfolios for themselves, who have a better mastery of the English language. And I felt that's something we've been trying to be really mindful of this year, and it kind of feels like we also have the same mindfulness requirement for evaluating students in these sort of heavily written communication, oral communication based classes. So I'm wondering if the three of y'all have any thoughts about that.
I don't have a ton of experience. I have largely Minnesotans come to my school, and they typically white Catholic Minnesotans from who are native English speakers. I have worked with students one-on-one if they're not native English speakers to do it, but I don't have a ton of experience. The main thing I'll say is that you shouldn't even assume that the native English speakers know how to use a rubric. This is a skill that needs to be taught to everyone and not just native English speakers, particularly at lower courses.
I would add to that I think, so I don't have a lot of experience with this either, but this year and last year, I have a student who is from China. He actually started at Shenandoah as an English as a second language student. So his English is not, he's certainly not fluent. He gets by. And for the first while in my mastery grading classes, he would redo the same concepts that he had mastered and didn't need to redo a lot. And so I would get them back. I mean, the good thing was he was remastering them every time. So I felt like he really knew what he was doing, but he did not understand the process. And I really think it was a language barrier. So I had to really pay attention in particular to him and sit down with him multiple times to be like, okay, here's what the process is, and come up with different processes for him in particular to help him. Turns out he was a cyber major. He's going to double major in math. So whatever we did worked because he decided the classes were what he wanted to do anyway. But I think paying really close attention to students who seem to be missing what it is you're trying to do, and trying to catch that early keeps it more level.
Yeah, this is something that I kind of worry about sometimes, because we do have a decent number of students from China or students from the Middle East in our programs, and the English proficiency varies quite a bit. So when I'm grading proofs, I typically try to leave some leeway for matters of style, because I don't want to give the impression that like it has to be like letter perfect. I want to make sure that they know they don't have to write it exactly the way I would, but there's like a certain minimum that they have to meet before I'll accept it. And I'm probably a little bit more lax with non-native speakers there than I would be with native speakers. It's not much, but I found that in general, I can have conversations with them if necessary, if I think it's a big thing. But usually, like, the revision process kind of helps them get up to that minimum level for what I'm looking for. So in practice, it hasn't been a huge issue, but it's sort of constantly churning in the back of my head.
Thank you, folks. And there's some really good discussion on this going on over in the chat as well, with people leaving great resources. Another Linda Nilsson book, Creating Self-Regulating Learners, which is one of my favorites. So do check out the chat, and that'll be available for you after the conference is over with. I'm going to give just a few more minutes for a couple more minutes for any other questions, but we do have our next session starting in about 5 minutes. So if you prefer to go ahead and leave and head over to that session, please do. I'll hang out here with our panelists for another maybe 2 minutes or so, and then I'll do the same. I want to thank all of our panelists here, all three of our panelists. They did a great job here. Very interesting discussion. I know my brain is almost completely full at this point of stuff to think about for the fall and beyond. So I want to thank you again. Thank all of you in the audience for participating today and for your questions and for your engagement. And we're going to have our goodbye session here in just a minute. It seems like the last 2 days have really flown by. So again, much appreciated, and I'll see you over there in the other session in just a few minutes.
And thank you, Robert, and the other organizers for getting all this together.
Mm-hmm.
So it's our pleasure. And I just have to say again that Sharona Krinsky is an absolute genius at putting together large events. I mean, she ought to be doing that for a living and doing math teaching on the side. I don't want to take her out of the classroom. She's awesome there too. But I mean, she should be making $1 million a year putting together big events. I mean,
The Zoom format has actually worked really well though too.
yeah, I think we're all sort of beginning to crack the Zoom code. I feel like it's like at first, it was really weird. Only a few people had ever used video conferencing software on a regular basis. But now, the more we use it, the more it's like we're figuring out the social norms. We're figuring out how to, how to just get things done.
And the chat is really valuable, and that's something that is not easily replicated just because it's not socially acceptable to be on your phone when someone's up there in the front talking. So
yeah,
there are benefits.
Yeah, and I think really gave the opportunity for people who wouldn't have had funding to come to get an opportunity to come anyway.
Yeah, without funding, or if they had health concerns, or like someone mentioned that they're pregnant and they're due in 3 weeks. Like there's no way I can get on a plane even if I could. Yeah, there's all sorts of things here too, and it's cheaper. The whole thing. I don't know if we've actually paid anything for this, to be honest, except for coffee.
A lot of carbon saved too.
Yes,
yeah, absolutely.
Cassie,
yeah.
I agree with the child care. I've seen lots of children in the background.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, accessibility, Spencer mentioned here. Mm-hmm. So
there are 27 people, and I saw Aaron asked about metacognition. Does anybody know how to do metacognition well? And the answer is no, but you can easily build in metacognition assignments where you read something and reflect on it. You talk about what's your favorite proof, what's the most difficult proof. And the fact of having explicit standards and specifications helps them, because they have to go through their work and say, okay, did I really define all my variables? And if my best semesters, I've actually only given credit to people who have identified the standards that they've used. So they might work on a problem, and they can identify that they did 3 standards there, they get credit all 3.
So nobody knows how to do metacognition well, but we're thinking a lot about how to do metacognition well. Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Okay, that's very metacognition there. Okay, well, I think we probably ought to head on over to the other session. It starts in a minute and a half. So I don't know who's straggling here. 16, 15 of you. Thanks again. See you over there in just a minute.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you all.
All right, take care.